Dara Horn is an American novelist, essayist, and professor of literature. She holds a Ph.D. in comparative literature in Hebrew and Yiddish from Harvard University. Dara is also the author of 5 novels, and in 2021 released a nonfiction essay collection titled People Love Dead Jews, which was a finalist for the 2021 Kirkus Prize in nonfiction. I spoke with Dara online about antisemitism in America, the Holocaust and Jewish memory, why people love dead Jews and living ones not so much, the state of the American Jewish community, and much more. I'm Dara Horn, the author of Figure It Out When You Get There, a memoir of stories about living life first and watching how everything falls into place, and a shtickle shalom, a student, his mentor, and their unconventional conversations. And this is Jewish People and Ideas, a podcast of conversations with Jewish thought leaders about contemporary Jewish topics. This conversation was recorded a few weeks before October 7th. I had planned on editing it and uploading it after Simchat Torah, but since the war began, my free time has been spent on trying to explain Israel's position in the world and pushing back against anti-Israel voices online. So my deepest apologies to my loyal listeners. I hope Be'ezrat Hashem in the future to have new episodes ready much faster than this time. Even still, the conversation is fascinating and totally relevant, and I hope you enjoy it. The title of your book is People Love Dead Jews. What's wrong with living Jews?
Well, so the title of the book is about the sort of role that dead Jews play in a wider non-Jewish world's imagination. And basically what it argues is that this wider non-Jewish world is only comfortable with Jews if Jews have no agency. So that can mean politically impotent or also conveniently dead. So that's sort of the problem with living Jews.
I want to talk about why people don't like Jews with agency. I mean,
well, yes,
that was our dream, right? We're persecuted for all of these years. We don't have rights. We're not allowed to have weapons. Now we finally do, and people like the memory of us, and they don't like the living of us.
Yes. I mean, it's a lot easier to like someone who's dead, who's not going to interfere with you and contradict you. And this is a dynamic in a lot of people's lives, right? It's
you're saying it's just human nature.
Relationships with people in your family, and when they've passed away, it's suddenly you are to have only affection for them, right? Even though you fought with them every day while they were alive, right? It's that's very common. But it's more than just that. It's also that there's this role that Jews play, this very large role in non-Jewish societies' imaginations. And it ultimately is a power dominance situation. And that's sort of what I uncovered behind all of these sort of very well-meaning manifestations of people loving dead Jews. And it was disturbing to realize that was where this was going. And ultimately, the book makes 2 arguments. One is that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And the corollary to that is that living Jews have to erase themselves in order to gain public respect.
Wow, I think you covered everything in that sentence right there.
So now you don't have
I mean, that's amazing.
Now you've got it. So,
well, I do have the book. I do have the book here, just to show you, even a hard copy.
Yes, well,
and I don't travel very often, but I went to visit my parents over COVID, and I was so happily sitting there on the plane because I look like a real Jew, and I'm reading this book, and I'm waiting for people's reactions. Nobody looked at me, though. I was waiting for people to come over and say something.
That's funny. I had someone who interviewed me about this book who said, I love reading this book on the train, because when I read this book on the train, no one sits next to me on the train.
That's what I was hoping for, but it didn't happen.
Well, people are assigned the seats on the plane, so they have fewer options of avoiding you, right? But
so you have a quote that I had mistaken the enormous public interest in past Jewish suffering for a respect for living Jews, but I was mistaken.
Yeah, I was very wrong about that.
Why did you think that, and how were you mistaken?
So this goes into this sort of whole story about how I unpacked all of this. So in some cases, this is about Holocaust commemoration, but it's really about any kind of sort of Jewish communities that don't exist anymore. Because, I mean, I've seen this everywhere from Spain to China and also here where I live in the United States. I made this mistake because I was growing up. I'm 46 years old, so I was, when I was a child I live in New Jersey where I grew up, and in the 80s and 90s, this was sort of real heyday of Holocaust remembrance events in the United States. This was when they built this giant museum in Washington, D.C. It was like the movie Schindler's List. It was sort of the beginning of this like outpouring of books about the Holocaust that were starting to be assigned in schools. There was like this was the time when a lot of states started mandating Holocaust education in schools. I mean, this was sort of the first time they'd ever taught anything in public schools about Jews. So it was sort of like, that's a win, right? I mean, that sort of, felt like that's a good thing.
Right.
And, or like any kind of conversation in public life about Jewish communities. And so that sort of felt like a good thing. And what I'm arguing in the book is not that these people who are propagating Holocaust commemoration or anything like that were doing this by any kind of negative motives. But what I eventually realized was that there's this unspoken assumptions that are built into that, and really there's really perverse motives that are not the fault of the people who are doing this, but it's sort of part of the cultural fabric of this non-Jewish society of what they expect a story about Jews to be about. Mm-hmm. And it has to eliminate agency for Jews. And it took me a long time to understand that. And I mean, yeah, I can tell you sort of the story of like how I came to this realization over, several years in the process of writing this book. But it is amazing that I made it into my 40s without understanding this.
I think I also didn't understand it. I understood something intuitively. I grew up in South Florida with a lot of Holocaust survivors. And even though I've got a lot of white hair, I'm 52. So I'm not that much older than you. And I felt it was a matter of Jewish pride that there were Holocaust commemorations, Holocaust speakers, Holocaust. It was like part of my Jewish identity. It was only later on that I realized the Holocaust has nothing to do with the Jews. It was what was done to the Jews. But it's not part of a Jewish identity. It's just that we grew up with people that wanted to make us remember. I think at the same time you had Jews not attached to Judaism. So you didn't have people that were excited to be Jews, and then you have a movement to push people to, exactly like you said, give up their agency and focus on remembering the past.
Well, so I think that was true in some Jewish communities at the time when it sounds like both of us were growing up in the United States. That's much less true today. I do think that this plays a really different role within the Jewish community than it does outside of it. My book is not about the role it plays within the Jewish community, which I think has evolved. And I think also, it's true that, yes, the Holocaust was not about the Jews in that sense, but the story of the Holocaust does have to do with Jewish history and the way that Jews have understood it and brought it into our understanding of Jewish history and Jewish memory. Uh-huh. I mean, for example, the Yiddish word for the Holocaust is Churban.
Which is not a Yiddish word.
Well, it is a Yiddish word. It's a Yiddish word that's also Hebrew. It's
destruction.
Yes, but it's referring specifically to the reason. There are other Yiddish words for destruction, but they use this word because it's a word for the Churban Beit HaMikdash, right, for the destruction of the two temples. Right. So, people who lived through the Holocaust saw this as part of a continuation of Jewish history.
And it was a Churban.
Yes, well, of course it is. And that is something that, so the way that it was seen within the Jewish community, it's quite different from how it was seen outside the Jewish community. And that's sort of, and I want to emphasize my book is really about this outside looking in kind of view. I've written elsewhere about sort of how attitudes toward the Holocaust and Holocaust commemoration and education have changed within the Jewish community. The Jewish community in the United States now, there's much less emphasis on Holocaust education and remembrance within the Jewish community. That isn't the thing that you're learning about if you go to Hebrew school or something like that. It's not very much less the focus within the Jewish community. What has happened, and actually this is something I don't really write about so much in the book. I write about it a little bit in the book, but I have recently, a couple months ago, I published a very long article in The Atlantic about Holocaust education in America.
Right, I read the article.
Yes, for which I did, I traveled around the country, I talked to hundreds of educators. What I discovered in that process of researching that piece was, and I do mention this in the piece, but I can say it to you more explicitly, I interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people for that article, most of whom didn't make it into the final article. I can count on one hand how many people I spoke to who were Jewish. This is now a field in the United States that really has nothing to do with Jews. The people who are running these museums are not Jewish. People creating the curricula for the schools are not Jewish. The people training the teachers are not Jewish. The teachers themselves are not Jewish. I mean, I remember I was at a Holocaust educators conference at the Dallas Holocaust Museum. It was for high school, middle school, and high school teachers. And I remember sitting in this conference with all these teachers from Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, and the people who were running the museum. The CEO of the museum is a woman named Mary Pat Higgins, and the people teaching it.
Nice Jewish name.
Yeah. And I remember at some point thinking, wow, other than the holograms, I'm the only Jew in this building.
Wow.
And I remember asking one of the docents there, and there were school museums where I followed around field trips from schools, but this one was not, because I was there for this teacher conference. I remember asking one of the docents there, actually a few docents, when students come from for the field trips to this museum in Dallas, Texas, what do they typically ask? And you know what this guy said? He said, you know what they ask? They ask, are there still Jews alive today?
I was going to ask you a question related to that. Yeah, that quote blew me away.
If you are in the museum, if you were walking through this museum, you wouldn't know. I mean, yes, are there panels here and there about contemporary Jewish life? Yes, but I mean, that's not what you're looking at when you come on your field trip with your, high school class. So, I mean, this is, so what the phenomenon that you referred to of like what we grew up with in the 80s and 90s of like this emphasis on Holocaust education within the community that was, coming directly from survivors, and it was almost like scare you into being Jewish or something. That, I don't really see that anymore in the United States, among Jewish communities in the United States. That's really not where the emphasis is. This is now like jump the shark. This is now moved to like non-Jewish communities where people like have like never met a Jewish person before.
So
and like
why
teachers at these conferences who are just like, I mean, literally these teachers aren't like, they've never had a Jewish student in their lives. And I'm just like, why are you teaching about the Holocaust?
Okay, that's my question. So why are they so into it?
The absence of Jews is exactly the appeal. They're using Jews as a symbol for something else, for some like universal lesson about humanity. And this is the point, and then I don't see this in the book explicitly or in that article explicitly. Actually, I did originally say it in the article explicitly, and it didn't make it through the editing. But this is a very common pattern in non-Jewish societies. What this non-Jewish society has done with Holocaust education is it's identical with what non-Jewish societies have always done with Jewish experiences, which is you take a Jewish story, a Jewish experience, you claim it happened to everyone and is a universal experience and happened to you, and then you say like, oh, there are still people here who are calling themselves Jews, those people are irrelevant. Like, living Jews are irrelevant. I mean, like, the church did this for thousands of years.
Replacement ideology, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's right. The church did this for thousands of years. Like, we're the new Israel, right? I mean, Islam did this. Like, we have the real prophecy.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
exactly,
so this is like a very, I mean, this is something, and I think it's so unconscious. I'm like, no one who's a Holocaust educator, I mean, these are like, I mean, this is thinking this. There's nothing, I want to be really clear. Every single person I spoke to was a Holocaust educator. Every single one of these people is a better person than I am. I mean, these are like, really, people who go into this, I mean, if this like people who go into this field because they're like motivated to make social change and to try to create a kinder and more generous world. I mean, and this is like, I mean, nobody is thinking this way. But I feel that this is like this unconscious thing in a non-Jewish culture that people just they're not conscious of it.
So,
of this like process of taking Jews and turning them into symbols and then at best ignoring living Jews or regarding living Jews at best as irrelevant. And at worst being like, why are you even still here? Like, why are you being so annoying and like being a person with agency? Or even worse, a collective political group with agency. Like that's like, doesn't get worse than that. So yes, I mean, this is like a whole dynamic. If you want for your listeners, I can go into more detail about sort of how I arrived at this, because the book is not a polemic. The book is really stories of sort of, I travel around the world and sort of find, look into these different situations where I see this dynamic at play.
Well, you're covering exactly what my next question is here. So it has two parts to it. The first is non-Jews love dead Jews because it makes them feel better about themselves and their ancestors. But why do Jews love dead Jews? And why do you think I found your book so entertaining? And I loved your podcast. And I'm telling you, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. Most of what I listen to is in Hebrew. And I really enjoyed every episode. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with me? Why do I love listening to stories about dead Jews?
Well, so this, I often get this question where people are like, oh, Jews propagate this problem too. I think it's a very different dynamic within the Jewish community. It has its own problems, but different problems. There's the thing about Jewish tradition is that it's entirely based on this idea of incorporating the past into the present. That's like the entire premise of Judaism. So, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's book Zachor talks about this, where he says that, his argument in that book is that, Jews don't actually, Jewish culture doesn't have an idea about history. It's only an idea about memory. And I think there's a line in there where he says that in Jewish culture, the past is not a series of events to be contemplated at a distance, but a series of situations into which one is existentially drawn.
What does existentially drawn mean?
Okay, so this is, and you know this, any person who's, living a Jewish life knows this. The way we regard the past is that we are participants in it, right?
Like the Seder.
Yes, of course, right? Like each person regards themselves
as if they left Egypt today.
Yeah, right? We were all standing at Sinai, right? This is really like, and it's also this whole process of reenactment. We're recording this before the Yamim Noraim. If you think about like the Avoda,
and the Beit HaMikdash, right? The Kohen HaGadol.
Yes, right. Like the recreation, like where you're bowing to the floor and, echat ve'echat.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't think about
when you
that.
Study, studying Gemara, how much of like Mishnah Gemara is like, it's like we have to learn about the plumbing in the Beit HaMikdash. Right. This is sort of like, we're like you make a map of the Beit HaMikdash based on like literally down to the plumbing. There's sort of like these details of the past that are not just like, as it says, it's situations into which to be existentially drawn. It is that you are standing at Sinai. Right. And I remember thinking this. I've published a bunch of novels. This is my first nonfiction book. I have 5 novels that all deal with Jewish history in different ways. And one of my books is about Jewish spies during the American Civil War. And I didn't realize at the time when I published that book that when you write a book about the Civil War in the United States and you publish it, people come to your readings in costume. This actually happened to me where, and actually if you listen to my podcast, I think I talk about, there's one of the episodes where I talk about this. People would come to my readings in like, their Confederate uniforms with their muskets and, they tell you how like every year they go to Gettysburg and they reenact the battle. And I remember like listening to these people and thinking, wow, you people are nuts. But then, of course, I go home and I build a sukkah in my backyard. And they're like, every year we build our tents at Gettysburg. It's like they're eating hardtack. We're eating matzah. But it's like there's still this like, it's similar, this idea of reenactment. It's like, Jews are like the original reenactors. So I do think that like the past plays a different role for Jews. And it sometimes is it is problematic and distorting in a lot of ways also. If you think about how much of both Israeli politics and Jewish communal politics is wrapped around this like assumption that like everybody's trying to kill you all the time, right? Which may not be a false assumption, but like is
I kind of feel that.
Yeah, right. Because there's this kind of look, you can be paranoid.
They are.
If you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you. But my point is rather that like those kinds, a lot of those, the way that Jews approach current events is very informed by this sort of long Jewish history. So, and I also think that there's this is something I've written about elsewhere and not in this book. And actually I've written academic pieces about this. Something that I call the Eicha problem, which is that, the traditional Jewish understanding of what we might today call antisemitism is that it is our fault.
The traditional Jewish view, you said?
In a sense, yes. Well, so there's a few different views you could talk about, but like, if you think about it as like Amalek, okay, then it's something that is, this sort of existential thing that can never be explained and persists through generations. But then there's this idea that you have in, I call it the Eicha problem because of Eicha, and it's also, it's in many places in the Tanakh, and it's, perpetuated even more in the Talmud. This idea, like, the reason I call it the Eicha problem is you think about Eicha, the whole idea is, Jerusalem is destroyed because of the people's sins.
Well, Eicha
this is the understanding,
is the prophecy of Yirmiyahu.
Yes, right.
Saying that the temple would be destroyed if everyone didn't get their act together.
Yes.
They ignored him, and it happened word for word what he said.
Yes, right. So, but this is an understanding.
And he escorted them into exile.
Right, but this is an understanding of political events, which is based on the deeds of the community, right? It's not based on any... In other words, it's sort of the opposite problem of the people love dead Jews problem. It's like the Jewish view is sort of has the opposite problem, which is like, it's only what the Jews do that matters.
I see what you're saying.
In other words, like, so, if you think about like that sugya in the Talmud where it's like about, the temple's destroyed because we neglected the children of the Beit Rabbah, and the temple's destroyed because people didn't observe Shabbat, but not one of these brilliant rabbis ever says the temple's destroyed because of the Babylonian superior weaponry.
Well, I would...
No one thinks about that, right? I mean, it doesn't come up. And that's, the attitude, it's almost like this sort of, it's the opposite problem. It's like this solipsistic view where, like, other parties don't have agency, right? And this is built into the, the religious perspective. What's interesting to me is it transcends the religious perspective. If you think about Bialik, when you come to, modern period, Bialik's poem about the Kishinev pogrom Be'ir HaHarega, right? And Ola Shchita, he has, like, these pogrom poems where, he becomes, it's like these poems of rage where he's, he sees that these people in the pogrom, they basically go and read Eicha after the pogrom, and they're like, doing the Ashamnu and asking God for forgiveness, assuming that this pogrom has happened because of their sins. And he's raging at them in these poems saying, like, no, this isn't happening because of your sins. It's happening because you failed to fight back. Right. And this becomes this, like, clarion call for modern Zionism. I mean, first of all, factually inaccurate. There actually was self-defense in these pogroms. So just going to say that right there. But also what's interesting to me about that is that's supposed to be this, like, break with tradition, right? Where he's protesting against this tradition that's encouraging people to be passive. But what's interesting to me is that he ends up in a very similar place because he still ends up saying that it's the Jews' fault, right? He's still saying it's because of something they did.
We've covered a lot of ground, right?
Right? And he's still... It's just fascinating to me. So this is sort of like, anyway, so this is, I didn't write about this in this book. This is way beyond, this is, to me, is a different topic, which is about... That's
okay. I wanted to go beyond the book anyhow, so I'm very happy to discuss this.
Yeah, this is a piece, I don't even know if it's like something you could find online, this piece I wrote, The Eicha Problem, although I did give a lecture about it once, and I know that that's on YouTube. If you look up my name.
It's very interesting. Yeah. I was going to mention Ruth Weiss at some point.
Yes, well, so I was her student, so as you will...
I know, that's why. I mean, besides the fact that we had a very interesting conversation, she and I, in her book, Jews in Power, she says, how do the Jews survive all of these conquests? She says because the Jews blame themselves and didn't blame the other nations for conquering them. And they said, well, God obviously wanted us to be conquered, so we'll have to be wherever we're going to be, but we're going to continue being Jews. Which is probably where that some of the hatred and suspicion of Jews comes from. The Jews didn't really integrate.
Oh, look, then you're doing it too.
Over history.
Wait, look, you're doing it too.
Tell me, please.
Look, see, you're saying like, oh, it's something the Jews did that caused what we now call antisemitism. I'm like, no.
No, I'm not saying that it caused it. I'm saying that that was one of the reasons that people would blame us, because we stick out. Am I saying that maybe I'm saying that I caused it? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is the thing. It's like this is sort of the whole argument I'm making in this book.
Explain it to me.
Pushing it back against this idea and how it is so ingrained in, let's call it Western societies, non-Jewish societies, that we don't even think about it. And the part I don't really unpack in the book is that it unfortunately fits in very closely. It's sort of, it's like a key in a lock. It does fit into, unfortunately, the Jewish self-perception, which makes the opposite mistake, in my opinion, of sort of blaming ourselves too much, right? And not, in excessively blaming ourselves. So that's, to me, that is like this, like, sort of perverse dynamic. But when I say that so I'm going to give an example that I give toward the end of the book about sort of how this is not even, people don't even think about this. And like I said, the people who are making these claims, I'm not claiming that, like, all these people are anti-Semitic or they're hateful or something like that. My point is not about, like, any individual's motive or anything like that. What I'm really just saying is that this is something that's it's in the water. So toward the end of the book, I write about attacks on the Haredi communities in New York and New Jersey that were happening just before the pandemic. Unfortunately, it's continued after that, but just before the pandemic, there were some lethal attacks, and this is where it's near where I live. I live in New Jersey. There was a attack on a kosher supermarket in Jersey City. This was, it's about 20 minutes from where I live, and where, these people were killed in this supermarket. There was also another attack in Muncie, New York, which is Haredi community in upstate New York. Mm-hmm. This is actually a really, truly, all these attacks are horrific, but this one was like somebody walked into a crowded Hanukkah party with a 4-foot machete and just started smacking people. Okay, so I want to say, and I want you to tell me if I'm blaming myself for this. That guy was crazy, right? I mean, yeah. He was just like some psychopath. I mean, yes, but like... He traveled for like an hour to get there or something like that. But like, here's what's interesting to me about this. It's like the voices in everyone's heads are all saying the same thing.
So I'm asking you. You're like my therapist.
I mean, so it's like the voices in his head told him to do this. Those voices didn't come from him.
But there are mentally ill people. Was he?
Of course there are mentally ill people. Yes.
Was it because he hated Jews or he was mentally ill?
Well, so this is what's interesting to me. So what I was writing in the book about is not specifically about the motivations of these attackers in these individual instances. In the book, what I'm exploring is less about the perpetrators, which, any given perpetrator has any given number of motives. I mean, lahavdil, but like during the Holocaust, there were plenty of people who were psychopaths who were promoted to positions of power, right? I mean, that was a regime that, gave those people a lot of opportunity. But anyway, and it's not about any one perpetrator. It's about the way the society as a whole regards this kind of attack. And what I do in the book is I read through every news story about those attacks. I mean, every possible news source in mainstream media, I should say, not within the Jewish, there are Jewish news outlets, but I was looking at sort of, mainstream American news outlets that were covering this attack, local and national news.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't find a news item about these attacks that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting the attack. So,
okay, but that's not Jews blaming themselves.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this larger society.
I understand. They're giving a reason that the guy...
That dynamic where it is assumed that it is these people's fault.
Right, I heard you say that you don't normally solve civil disputes with a machete.
Yes, and it was amazing because you'd read reports about that attack and they're all like, well, there's been all these zoning battles between the Haredi and, or Hasidic and non-Hasidic residents of this town. And I'm like,
right.
Do we normally resolve municipal disputes with a machete? Because, silly me, I left mine at home before the last school board meeting, right? I mean, it was sort of like this absurd idea, but like, this is, these are mainstream news articles are printing this like this is normal, right? Like, well, of course, all these tensions, because of the zoning, right? Because, these people are trying to, put up an A-roof. Right? It was like this.
Why?
Well, I mean, it would be like it's it's victim blaming, right? I mean, it would be like if there was a news article about somebody a woman who was sexually assaulted, and you have half the article talking about what she's wearing. Mm-hmm. I mean, the only purpose of doing that is to send a signal to the public that these people deserved it, and that's the signal.
And
that
they're saying it's conscious or unconscious.
Sending the signal?
Yeah,
I don't think it's conscious. I mean, maybe I'm being overly generous. I don't think it's conscious. It's sort of because it's amazing. Like, I mean, in the attack in Jersey City, every article was talking about how these, this was a Hasidic, specifically Satmar community, but every article was about how this Hasidic community was gentrifying a minority neighborhood, which is, as I put in the book, I'm like, it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, these people were fleeing gentrification. They were in New Jersey because they were priced out of Brooklyn, right? I mean, this is like why everyone is in New Jersey. So that was one thing, Second of all, like, I mean, when you say like these people are gentrifying a minority neighborhood, like these people are like highly visible members of like the top #1 hate crime target according to the FBI, right? These are not like generic white people here. Like these are not like white hipsters, moving in with their coffee shops. And number 3 is like, is there this murderous rage against gentrification? Like, are people walking into cool coffee shops with automatic weapons and like, blowing away people, hipsters with man buns and tattoos? Like, I haven't seen that happening. Like, why are we pretending that this is about gentrification? And the answer is really obvious. It's like, oh, these are like rich Jews who are like taking people's money. And I'm sure that the people who are writing these articles aren't consciously thinking this. I mean, maybe I'm being generous in saying that, but it's just like really clear, like that. Like I said, it's like it's in the water, right? I mean, people are thinking this without even knowing that they're thinking it. Like, that's how... Where
are the Jews standing up for Haredi Jews?
So after these attacks happened, there was a massive movement in New York and New Jersey where they organized these protests. So this is actually, I know what you're referring to is like, there's often this sense like, oh, the rest of the Jewish community is abandoning the Haredim. That was not happening in this case. It was like 20,000 people came to this march in New York City that was organized. It was not organized by the Haredi community. In fact, if anything, you could criticize the Haredi community for not having a bigger presence at this march. But people are busing in from Ohio to go to this march. I mean, it was 20,000 people.
Oh, that's very impressive. I didn't know that.
Yes, and it was not organized. It was organized by like broader Jewish community, like Jewish Federation. These are like American Jewish Committee, I think, organized part of it. It was created by, broader umbrella groups in the Jewish community. It did not come from the Haredi community. And that was in solidarity with the Haredi community. So, yeah.
So do you think...
I think that's changed also. Like this whole like, oh, we don't, non-Haredi Jews are not talking. I mean, you still see that, but...
That's what I want to ask you. Do you feel there's a sense of unity amongst American Jews? Because my perception from over here, and I really get most of my information through only Israeli media, is that there's the little isolated Haredi communities. And then there's the majority of secular Jews. Some are connected to Reform. Conservative is pretty much gone. And then there's this big block of Jews of no religion. And you do feel that there's a sense of unity there?
I don't think there's a sense of unity, but I think that those denominational differences that you're referring to, that's a very outdated thing. Like, I don't think people care about that anymore. Actually, I think the divide now is political. I would say there isn't a lot of unity in the Jewish community, but the reason for, because people have asked me this, like, oh, do people like unite when there's like these anti-Semitic attacks? And it's like, kind of, but not really, because unfortunately it's become an opportunity for polarization, and it's political polarization.
So you're saying American Jews became more American?
No, I think I think that the same polarization, it's obviously happening in Israel. I think this is happening everywhere, and I think it has to do with, social media. I think there are other factors that have encouraged polarization of societies. But it is true that it is, talking about anti-Semitism within the American Jewish community is now a divisive conversation because many people will use it as a political tool. It's like, and I've realized that this is sort of something people do as a defense mechanism.
But that's unrelated to being Jewish. That's just everyone. That's what you're saying. You said in America and also over here.
Yes, I do think that's true, but I think that for the Jewish community, it becomes a way of it sometimes can be a way of denying reality. So basically what often will happen after these, and it doesn't even have to be like a physical attack. It can be like whatever stupid thing, the Kanye West says he's this, major star, and he says all these, he's got more followers online than there are Jews in the world, and he's like posting all this anti-Semitic garbage. Or like, actually just this week, like Elon Musk started posting all this stuff. And, it's like whenever something stupid happens, it often the response from the Jewish community is not very unified, because often it becomes a polarized conversation where it's people will, basically the people say that, the real problem with anti-Semitism is coming from people who don't vote like me. Whoever those people are. It's like almost doesn't matter. Right.
Which is unrelated.
People who don't vote like me. And, it's like the real problem is the people who don't vote like me. And the thing is, what I've realized is that's kind of a protective mechanism that people use, because that I think masks the community's vulnerability, because it makes you think that you have control, because you sort of think like, oh, I chose the right team and my team will protect me. And unfortunately, it is this situation where like you're not protecting yourself and where you're relying on a team to protect you. So, which is, unfortunately, the situation of, that's the situation of Jews in the diaspora community.
In America.
Yeah, or as a situation of minority communities. So
I want to come back to the Holocaust Museum. You have a chapter here, Blockbuster Dead Jews, regarding an exhibition, Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, which is an excellent name, by the way. And you said they did everything right.
Yes, they named their Auschwitz show after a Star Wars tagline.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that was Star Wars. Yeah. I had no idea. You did mention the book now I remember, but because I didn't make the connection. I saw Star Wars like 1977 or something.
Long ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Oh, wow. That's terrible. I didn't realize
that. It's terrible. Yeah. That's sort of like, yeah.
So you have a fascinating quote here. The idea was that people would come to these museums and learn what the world had done to the Jews, where hatred can lead. Then they would stop hating Jews. It wasn't a ridiculous idea, but it seems to have been proven wrong. A generation later, anti-Semitism is once again the next big thing, and it's hard to go to these museums today without feeling that something profound has shifted. So what shifted?
Okay, so in that piece in the book, I didn't research this, but now I actually have.
Lucky for me.
Yes, well, so, it's not, yeah. So listeners can look this up. It was a long piece I wrote in The Atlantic with a headline. I did not write this headline. The headline of that piece is Holocaust Education Making Anti-Semitism Worse? Oh,
I read that. Yeah, right, we talked about that. But it was a good title.
It was, this was an article that pissed off a lot of people, or as we say in the publishing industry, started a conversation.
I like
yeah,
that.
I started a conversation. So yes, I mean, basically, what I did in the
Wait, why did it piss off a lot of people?
Oh, because there's so much invested in this idea that Holocaust education prevents anti-Semitism. It's like, this is the go-to solution. Like when it's like the final solution to the Jewish question, but I'm sorry I did that. Yeah, no, it's really, it's the go-to solution. Like whenever there's like, you know, it happened in my children's school. Like there's an anti-Semitic incident in the school. Like they go and have some Holocaust survivor come and speak to the class. Right? Like this is the go-to. It's like, you know, when there's, you know, even in the governmental level, the states will respond to, you know, rising, you know, anti-Semitic hate crimes. They'll be like, let's pass a Holocaust education mandate and require kids to learn about the Holocaust in school. And it's like, what I think is fascinating is that, like, you know, they've had Holocaust education in American public schools for 50 years now. It is 50 years. But what's amazing to me is like rates of anti-Semitism, no matter how you measure it, no matter whose statistics you use, much higher now than it was certainly from the 1970s when this began.
Wow.
And also especially from the 1990s, which was when you had sort of the biggest push toward Holocaust education in schools and in museums and public programs and things like that. These, you know, rates of anti-Semitism are much higher now. And I mean, correlation does not imply causation, but I'm sort of looking into like, well, what happened? And so, but what you find is that, like, if you look at sort of how Holocaust education is taught, it is taught as this morality play, where it is isolated from the rest of history. It's isolated certainly from Jewish history, where people know absolutely nothing about Jewish history other than this.
Mm-hmm.
It's also isolated from European history or Western history. Like it's taught like as this like case study in morality. I couldn't think of anything else that we think about that we teach this way. That's like a historical event that's taught, first of all,
without context,
extracted from its context, number one. But number two, also like treated as a morality play, where like, what are we going to learn from this event, right? And like,
it's not, because it's a mistake.
Well, I mean, it's just like a ridiculous way to think about history. And I mean, it's not just that it's a ridiculous way to think about history; it's reductive and it eliminates people. And so, if your goal, I mean, and the bigger problem is that, I mean, there's a lot of problems with this. But there's a lot of problems with this. But what I found, what was amazing to me was, there's studies that have shown this. So this is not just like my instincts. Like this is the most robust study. This actually was not in the United States. It was in the United Kingdom, in England, where they've had mandatory Holocaust education in a national curriculum for over 20 years. And there are these researchers who did this. It was about 6 years ago. I think it was in 2016 or 2017. They published this study it was a very, you know, by standards of these things, a very robust study. It was like 8,000 secondary school students. And what was amazing about that study is even the students who learned all the things they were supposed to learn in the class, like the people got all the factual questions accurate, you know, so they didn't sleep through the class, right? They were there. They learned about the Holocaust. Even those students, the researchers found there was one question no one could answer, which is, why did the Nazis target the Jews? And they did focus groups with these students. And so when they interviewed them and they pressed them on this question, you know, why did the Nazis target the Jews? Like, you know, why did this happen, basically?
It's a good question.
Well, but the kids' answers came from Nazi propaganda. The kids were like, well, I guess the Jews were rich because they had taken the Germans' money.
It makes sense if that's what they're taught.
Well, I mean, it's just, it was bonkers. And the other amazing thing is that, like, in these students who had been through this Holocaust curriculum, over 85% of them could define the word racism. Over 85% of them could define the word homophobia. Less than a third of them could define the word anti-Semitism.
But they couldn't say that it's hatred of Jews?
They didn't know that word. Because they're teaching the Holocaust as this, like, universal lesson in morality, where, like, the moral of the story is we all have to be nice to each other. Oh, and then there's another, and this is actually, to me, this is the biggest problem, is the way this is often taught in the United States, and this is a very well-meaning approach, where, and it's not just taught, we don't only do it for Holocaust education, it's also done in many curricula where we learn about history of American racism, let's say. There's this sort of way that we often will teach people how not to be bigoted, where the message is basically, see this group of people over here who you might be prejudiced against. You shouldn't hate those people because they're just like you and me. They're just like everyone else. Right. You know, and if only you knew that they were just like you and me and just like everyone else, like you wouldn't hate them. And this is very much the approach of Holocaust education in the United States, where the stories that are told, it's people like Anne Frank. You know, whereas Anne Frank is an extremely atypical victim of the Holocaust in that, 80% of the people murdered in the Holocaust are Yiddish speakers. She's not a Yiddish speaker. She's not religious, right? She's like living a Western life. She's a very assimilated person, you know, whereas like much more typical victims of the Holocaust were like Haredim.
But they're not like us.
Right? Who are not just like you and me. And so, but like that's the image that we're pushing. And you see this, I mean, I could go into like various ways that this image is pushed. But the problem is like, you know, if the big lesson, if the big take home that we're supposed to learn is that you shouldn't hate Jews because Jews are just like everyone else. Well, the problem with that lesson is Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everyone else. I mean, it's almost like the premise of Judaism, right? I mean, like uncoolness is sort of Judaism's brand.
Anti-cultural.
I mean, yeah, well, I mean, like, Jews have always been uncool ever since, you know, I mean, think about the ancient Near East, everybody else is worshiping this, you know, Marvel cinematic universe of sexy deities, and the Jews are like, the losers in the school cafeteria were like, oh, we have our bossy, unsexy, invisible God.
Right, the universal God.
Jews have never been cool. And so it's like, if you're teaching, this is a fatal flaw in trying to teach people to live in a pluralistic society.
So how would you teach it?
I mean, so, well, what I've sort of been thinking about, and I actually am sort of now taking a more active role in working on this, what I noticed is, like, certainly in the United States, like, there's like 35 states in the United States where there's some form of mandatory Holocaust education. There's not a single state in the United States where students are required to learn in school who are Jews.
Who are the Jews,
yeah,
or who are
what
Jews?
What they mean to be Jewish.
Ah.
Yeah. And so it's like that no one is learning that. And I mean, the reality is Jews are, I mean, I know that, you know, we think that this is this robust Jewish community, which it is, but like the United States is big. Jews are 2.5% of the population also, and Jewish communities are also concentrated in a particular area. Like most Americans will never meet someone Jewish. And so it's sort of like, well, and the only thing they're learning about in school is dead Jews, right? And then they don't learn why these people were killed. It's just like, oh, that was sad and we should be nice to people. And then it's like, where are they getting their information about Jews? Basically the internet. I mean, that's a disaster. Okay. So, you know, that's like, and I was at one of the advisors to the White House had this interagency task force to combat antisemitism. They called me. I mean, I don't want to, they called like, I think they had 1,000 people they consulted. So I was, you know, I don't want to overplay this. I was one of 1,000 people they consulted. And my suggestion to them was like, you know, maybe we should teach people who Jews are, because what they're learning about Jews is what they see on the internet, and nobody's giving them any other information.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Let's try to define who are Jews. Sure. You can't.
No,
I can.
I don't think that's true.
I live a religious life. I live a halachic life, so I can tell you exactly what a Jew is. But somebody else might say, but that's not me, and I'm Jewish.
Okay, so this isn't that hard. So, I mean, and people hide behind the pretending this is difficult. It's only difficult because of the non-Jewish societies have certain boxes that Jews don't fit into. So, you know, I mean, this is something that happens all the time. I speak at a lot of college campuses in the United States, and people always will ask this question, you know, oh, are Jews a religion, or Jews a race, or Jews a nationality? I'm like, well, here's the problem. Jews predate all of those categories. You're trying to put Jews in a box, in the boxes that you have with the language you're speaking. Jews predate those boxes. Mm-hmm. And so there is an answer to this, was just, you know, Jews are a type of social group that was actually quite common in the ancient Near East, and it just happens to be not very common in the modern West, this is a joinable tribal group. So joinable is important because obviously people can become Jewish. It's a joinable tribal group with a shared history, homeland, and culture. Part of that culture is a non-universalizing religion. Non-universalizing mean, unlike Christianity and Islam, you know, we don't want everyone to be Jews. Right, it's not part of our religion that we want everybody to agree with us, right? I mean, It's not, in fact, I wouldn't even say, like, religion's not even really the right word. In fact, even in Hebrew, you know, I think it's Eliezer ben Yehuda who, like, picked out this word dot from the Talmud and was like, let's use this to mean religion. Like, there isn't really a word that means religion the way that, you know, our Christian and Muslim neighbors think about that word, where it's like this sort of dogmatic set of beliefs, right? Where, like, you check these boxes and you believe these things and then you're in or out. Like, the Judaism just doesn't really work that way. So it is, yes, it's a joinable tribal group with a shared history, homeland, and culture. Part of that culture is a non-universalizing religion. What I just said in English was a paragraph. In Hebrew, it's the word am.
Which is nation.
Well, I mean,
Am Yisrael.
It's like, but it's not nation. It's not a medina.
No, not a country. An am is an ethnic group.
Well, but even ethnic is not the right word either, because obviously there are many ethnic groups within Judaism, right? There's Ethiopian Jews, there's Ashkenazi Jews, there's Sephardi Jews, there's Taimani, there's
No, but they're all part of the
ethnic is my point is only that ethnic is also a word that was designed to indicate something that's different from the scenario that Jews are in. So, but the word that is appropriate is Am.
So how would you translate Am?
It's very difficult because, and the reason it's difficult to translate is because this concept doesn't exist in a lot of, in the modern West.
Well, I find this fascinating. My brain is doing little knots.
I translate it as a people. But this is part of what we need to explain. And I'm doing some work now with some groups in the United States that are doing this, where they send people into public schools to talk about these things. So, yeah, there are movements. And also I'm involved with right now a museum called the Weitzman, which is it's actually National Museum of American Jewish History, but they're redesigning the museum, and their goal is, like, in their redesign is to be a resource for the broader American public to learn about Jewish life and culture.
Where is that museum?
It's in Philadelphia. It's actually right on the it's right across from the Liberty Bell and next to Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. So it's kind of an amazing place where they are. And it originally was Mikveh Israel, which is one of the earliest synagogues in the United States. I think it's maybe second oldest synagogue in the United States from the colonial period. And it was originally their collection that they're building on. So anyway, I am involved in these efforts. I mean, it's going to take a long time to mature to the point where Holocaust education is, where you have like holograms and stuff like that. But I think I don't think that's the answer. I don't think that's going to solve the problem of anti-Semitism, but I think I think it can only be positive to change a conversation to be talking about living Jewish communities instead of having the one thing people know about Jews is that they were murdered.
So we're getting towards the end now. I have a concluding question, but before that, I want to ask you, we spoke about this for almost an hour. Anti-Semitism, who's a Jew, what people should learn. And you're a mother of 4 children, Kai and Hara.
Yes.
And they're young enough, they're still being educated. What do you say to them? What's your conclusion? My conclusion was to move here to Israel. And I moved here in part because of all the Holocaust, brainwashing, shoved down my brain. I don't walk into Yad Vashem. My wife and our kids, we have 7 kids, Bli Anara. 2 are married. We have grandchildren already, Baruch Hashem. We once went for a hike in the Jerusalem forest, and my wife is like, oh, there's Yad Vashem. I said, you all can go in. I'm not going into Yad Vashem. I live outside of Yad Vashem. The living state of Israel is my answer to the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. It's true our enemies sometimes get through, but we shoot back. That's my answer. What's your answer?
So I had this thought when I was about maybe a similar age to when you were made Aliyah. I remember thinking, I had spent a bunch of summers in Israel and when I was a teenager, and I remember thinking about like, oh, should I be making Aliyah? And ultimately what I ended up thinking about was, I felt like when I was in Israel, I felt like there are a lot of people like me here. And what I meant by that was people who were really excited about Jewish culture, really wanted to do new things and create new things in Jewish culture. I was like, there are a lot of people like me here. And I thought about the United States and I said, there aren't a lot of people like me there. I sort of felt like the work I want to do, I'm more needed in the United States. I spent 20 years writing these novels about Jewish life. I'm sort of a public educator in a lot of these ways. I have a doctorate in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. I teach college classes. I, do a lot of public events, and basically getting people excited about Jewish life and culture and reinventing it. I think that that's something that can happen anywhere in the world. I think it's certainly happening in Israel in many ways. Mm-hmm. I feel that the community, so in terms of like what I teach my children, I mean, I do teach them Hebrew, not because I expect them to make Aliyah, but because I expect them to be part of a global Jewish community, number one. And number two, I expect them to be able to read our texts, right? And to be able to dive into, Jewish history and traditions and to understand them. That's really important to me. But really also just like for my children, what's important to me is making sure that they understand that they're part of the story. And that's something that they've absolutely taken to heart. Mm-hmm. I will tell you that like our Pesach Seder every year, we build out our house where we turn this into like this walkthrough adventure through the Pesach story, where it's like, I mean, we cover all the wall, like we have a basement room where we cover all the walls in black with like neon paint, and there's like black lights so it like glows in the dark. And we have like kids in costumes who are acting out these stories. I remember for my daughter, for her bat mitzvah, she was Parshat Lech Lecha. This is years ago. My daughter's now 18, but I remember she was Parshat Lech Lecha. And she didn't want to give a Dvar Torah. She was like nervous about it. She's like, oh, I don't want to do something boring. And she decided in the end to not make it boring she dressed as Avraham Avinu, and she gave the Dvar Torah from Avraham Avinu's point of view. So it's like, there's this sort of, my children have this idea that they are part of the story, right? That this is their story, they're part of the story.
Got it.
I think that today we have a situation in Israel and the United States where this is almost like, Eretz Yisrael and Bavel at the time of the Amoraim, where you have these two
great Jewish communities.
Yes, which are essential to each other in many, many ways and interrelated with each other. And I think that relationship is only going to become more and more important for us to understand each other and to be in constant contact with each other, which we're very fortunate. I mean, I think of the, I forget what they're called, all those people like Rav Dimi and Ula and the people who used to like go between Eretz Yisrael. I mean, think how much think how hard that was for those people to do it, and they managed it. And it's so much easier for us. Here we are speaking on Zoom and enjoying each other's company.
Yeah, we didn't have to do any bloodletting when we arrived in Eretz Yisrael. That's what they would do. They would bloodlet and then eat meat to recover from the trip. We have
yes, and here we are. I didn't. You're in Jerusalem and I'm in New Jersey, and we're having this conversation. So I think that there's I don't think that there's an answer.
Okay, I'd like to ask more, but I really tried to finish after an hour, so I'm not going to.
Okay.
When you finish answering this, I have one more question, then we're done.
Sure.
Do you want to say anything else? Because I interrupted you.
I think that, I feel like there was a generation for whom like Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael was like the answer. And I think that there was a time when it seemed like, these Jewish communities in diaspora were unsustainable. I think we're now coming up on, it's going to be, in 2054, it's going to be 400 years of American Jewish community.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, this is 400 years. This is not like a fly-by-night community here.
Although Polish Jews were in Poland for 1,000 years. I'm not saying there's a Holocaust coming to America, but there have been long Jewish communities.
Yes, but this is one of them. I mean, there were also Jews in Babylonia for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is a robust community. I mean, if anything, like this community has certainly lasted longer than any of the independent kingdoms in the state of Israel.
Yeah, well, that's a separate topic. What's going on over here?
So far, yeah. But I'm saying even if you look at in ancient times,
yeah, of course,
there was no sovereign Jewish community that lasted 400 years.
No, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask you the final question, which I normally give in advance, but because you're an author and you're a creative person, I trust you're going to come up with an answer without taking too much time. I call it my billboard question. So imagine you have a giant billboard. Millions of Jews are going to stop and read something on the billboard. What message would you put on your billboard?
People do this in the United States. There is like this group that makes these obnoxious billboards about Jewish identity all over the United States.
I had no idea.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They're like snarky things about antisemitism. And they're hot pink. They're very obnoxious. So
what would you put on your billboard?
I'm a writer. I don't know if I want to put something on a billboard. I mean, like, what do you mean by putting something on?
I'll give you examples of what other people said. The most common answer, and this is the 18th interview I've done for the podcast, You're Chai, is Am Yisrael Chai.
Yeah.
That's what everybody likes to say. Or be part of the Jewish story.
I was going to say something like that, like Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker.
Ah, that's good.
Yeah, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker is a good one. But also, Hinei ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad.
Well, which one do you pick and why?
I mean, I would go with Hinei ma tov because, for two reasons. Number one, pluralism among a Jewish society, among our worldwide Jewish community, to sit with our brothers and sisters, and notice it doesn't say sit in peace with our brothers and sisters. We can be having very contentious conversations with our brothers and sisters, but look how beautiful it is to all sit together.
Mm-hmm.
But also for the American Jewish community, we are here with our non-Jewish neighbors and building bridges with our non-Jewish neighbors. And, sometimes that's easier than other times. And, it's something that we, in living in a non-Jewish society, that's something you have to invest in as well.
Right.
So, yeah, and educating people. And that's something I actually do a lot. I speak a lot in non-Jewish settings. I've been on Christian TV and I speak at churches and I speak also at just a generic corporate events and, community events that are just open to the public. And I've had a lot of actually, that's the one thing that's made me really hopeful. And after publishing this book, I've honestly felt kind of despairing about my response I've gotten from this book from Jewish readers, but I've actually been quite inspired by the responses I've gotten from non-Jewish readers who have been, there's just a lot of people out there with a whole lot of goodwill who really want to do the right thing and are eager to learn how to do that. So that's, yeah. Yeah.
That's really nice to hear. I'm happy to hear that. Because sometimes, over here we get like a tainted view of American Jewry and what's going on over there.
That's very important to your self-image.
Yeah, the Zionist view is the end of the galut, the end of the exile.
Yeah, this is Shlilat HaGalut. It's like that. They have to do that. Yeah, they have to do that.
So thank you very much, Dara. Thank you for your time. And this was very interesting. I was saying at one point, you twisted my brain a little bit, making me try to figure out what you were saying and what am I saying. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
That was Dara Horn, novelist, essayist, and Ph.D. in comparative literature in Hebrew and Yiddish. I hope you enjoyed our conversation, my sweetest friends. And B'ezrat Hashem, I'll be doing more conversations in the near future. As I said in the beginning, my apologies for the delay, and I hope that new episodes will be uploaded much faster. In the meantime, if you're not yet listening to my other podcast, the Hasidic Story Project, please just do a search for Hasidic Story Podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts or on YouTube, and make sure to listen to that podcast as well.